Good evening, dear friends. If you enjoy quiet stories about the people who shaped our world, you can subscribe, but only if you truly like spending your time this way. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Let's slow down together. Lower the volume just a little and let your thoughts settle. Tonight's story is calm, but it isn't light. It's about a woman whose life unfolded beneath the brightest lights on earth, yet somehow remained full of shadows. It's the story of Diana Spencer, the Princess of Wales. Everyone thinks they already know her. For years, her face filled newspapers, documentaries, biographies, even fairy tale books. We know the smile, the tilt of her head, the shy glance beneath long lashes. We know the famous wedding, the crowded balcony, the heartbreak. But behind all that, behind the glitter and the grief, was a person, young, uncertain, often frightened, who found herself trapped between two worlds, the cold traditions of royalty and the heat of worldwide fame. When people remember Diana today, they remember emotion. But historians remember something else as well. How perfectly her story captured the mood of the late 20th century, the end of old hierarchies, the rise of the media age, the slow unraveling of privacy. In her short life, the world changed, and she became both symbol and victim of that change. It's easy to forget how new that world was. In the early 1980s, the monarchy still felt ancient and solid, untouched by the rhythms of celebrity culture. Television had just begun to make royalty human. A young teacher's assistant named Diana Spencer suddenly became not only the fiancée of a prince, but also the first royal figure whose every gesture was filmed, replayed, magnified, and sold. Her smile could move stock prices. Her sadness could fill entire tabloids. No queen before her had lived in such a mirror. Yet this is not simply a tale of fame and tragedy. It's a study in contrasts, warmth versus duty, emotion versus discipline, image versus identity. It asks questions that are still alive today. How much of ourselves do we give to the public? What happens when empathy becomes performance? And can love survive inside a system built on hierarchy and restraint? When I first thought of speaking about Diana, I hesitated. Her name is so wrapped in gossip that it feels almost impolite to say it without quotation marks. But then I realized the gossip itself is part of the story, because never before had private life become such a public battlefield. Through Diana, we can trace the birth of modern celebrity and the way it consumes both the admired and the admirers. Historians now treat her life as a case study. In universities, her interviews and the endless newspaper clippings are used to teach students how to read sources, how to separate fact from myth when emotion clouds the record. Every version of Diana tells us something different about the culture that created her. There is Diana the fairy tale princess, Diana the martyr of the press, Diana the rebel against the crown, Diana the humanitarian, and Diana the lonely woman who never escaped herself. Each portrait reflects not only who she was, but who we wanted her to be. To understand her story, we need to hold two truths at once. She was both powerful and powerless, adored by millions, yet profoundly alone. She shaped the image of the modern monarchy, yet was destroyed by the same image. The light that made her visible also made her vulnerable. There's another reason why her life remains important. Through her, we see how personal suffering forced a public conversation about things that used to be whispered, about eating disorders, depression, and emotional pain inside respectable families. When she spoke about her illness, when she admitted fear, the world changed a little. People realized that sadness could live even in palaces, and that honesty, even clumsy and raw, could be more powerful than the perfect royal smile. In that sense, Diana's story is not only British. It belongs to everyone who has ever tried to live under expectation. She was born into privilege, but felt trapped by it. She longed for normal affection and kept finding ceremony instead. And in trying to break free, she showed both courage and recklessness, the same qualities that made her unforgettable. This documentary will not seek villains or saints. We'll move slowly, one chapter at a time, following her life as it unfolded, from her family's distant past to the final night in Paris, and then to the silence that followed. We'll notice how each step prepared the next, how a shy girl from an old country house became the most photographed woman in the world, and how the world itself learned something, painful but necessary. Diana once said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. That phrase was mocked at first, too sentimental, too naive. But perhaps that was exactly what she became. Not a ruler in gold and velvet, but a mirror of human feeling. Her life reminds us that emotion can challenge institutions, that empathy can become political power, and that love, even misdirected, can leave a permanent mark on history. So let's begin quietly. Let's step back from the headlines, the gossip, the endless retellings. Let's look at Diana Spencer not as an icon, but a thread running through the fabric of her time. A time when the world was learning to watch and people were learning to be watched. Because only by seeing her story clearly, without noise or pity, can we understand why it still matters. To understand Diana Spencer, we have to begin long before her birth, in the quiet hills and damp fields of late medieval England. Because Diana's story was never only hers. It carried the weight of a family name that had been part of British life for almost 5 centuries, the Spencers. The family first appeared not as courtiers, but as traders. In the 15th century, when England was still a patchwork of manors and market towns, the Spencers made their fortune in wool. They bred sheep so fine that even distant merchants came to buy from them. The historian Thomas More once wrote that sheep devoured men, describing how profitable flocks pushed peasants off their land. The Spencers were among those who thrived during that transformation. From open fields they built estates, from estates they built titles, and from titles they built identity. By the late 1400s, one branch of the family had settled in a large country house at Althorpe, a quiet estate in Northamptonshire, surrounded by trees and long silver ponds. At first, they rented it. Later, they bought it. And through the centuries, Althorpe became more than a home. It became a symbol of continuity, a reminder that while monarchs came and went, certain families remained. It was in those same rooms, lined with portraits of ancestors, that Diana would grow up and, many years later, be buried. The Spencers rose quickly. By the 16th century, they were knighted, entered Parliament, and moved among the powerful. They married into other noble families, learning the unspoken language of rank. Who speaks first? Who walks ahead? Who bows to whom? By the 17th century, they were among the richest landowners in England, confident enough to trade witticisms with dukes. One story tells of a proud Spencer lecturing the House of Lords about his family's ancient virtues. A rival, the Earl of Arundel, interrupted. "In those ancient times, your ancestors were herding sheep." To which the Spencer calmly replied, "And yours, my lord, were plotting treason." The chamber laughed, and the insult never troubled the Spencers again. It was the kind of quick dignity that English aristocracy admired, pride delivered with perfect restraint. Over the generations, the family branched. The elder line became the Spencers-Churchills, the Dukes of Marlborough, the same line that produced Winston Churchill. The younger branch remained at Althorp. That was Diana's branch. Less titled, perhaps, but deeply conscious of being part of something old and distinguished. For the young Diana, this heritage was not just background noise, it was identity. She grew up surrounded by portraits of ancestors in powdered wigs, silver cups engraved with crests, and a landscape that whispered family legend. When people later called her simply Lady Di, they forgot that the title Lady came not from her marriage, but from her birth. She was, long before royalty noticed her, the daughter of one of England's great houses. The sense of lineage would follow her all her life. It gave her both confidence and trouble. Confidence because she truly believed she belonged to something noble. Trouble because she measured herself against impossible standards of grace. When, years later, during the painful negotiations of her divorce, someone reminded her that she might lose the title Her Royal Highness, Diana answered calmly, "I had my own title when I came into this family." It was more than pride. It was a statement of belonging and of distance. There was also a hidden rivalry woven into that remark. For centuries, the Spencers considered themselves older and, in a sense, purer than the House of Windsor. The Windsors, after all, descended from a line of German princes invited to rule Britain in the 18th century. The Spencers saw themselves as English to the bone, the soil of the island almost mixed into their blood. It is a small, quiet prejudice, but one that shaped how Diana viewed her royal in-laws. To her, the Windsors were proper, yet foreign, disciplined, yet cold. She, in contrast, carried the confidence of an old English line that had learned grace without grandeur. When she watched the film Spencer many years later, a portrait that would interpret her as haunted by ancestry, she might have smiled. Because for her, that name truly mattered. It reminded her that she belonged somewhere before she ever became part of the crown. But noble birth alone never guarantees happiness. Her father, John Spencer, was heir to the title Earl Spencer. At the time of Diana's birth, he had not yet inherited the earldom. He lived on the estate as a tenant of his own father, waiting for his turn. Diana's mother, Frances Roche, came from another ancient family, but their marriage was turbulent. The house at Park House, near Sandringham, where Diana spent her early childhood, looked serene from the outside. Brick walls, green lawns, and the distant bells of the royal church. Yet inside, arguments echoed behind closed doors. John and Frances had 4 children before Diana, but 2 died in infancy. That loss scarred the marriage. When Diana was born in July 1961, her father wanted a boy, an heir to the earldom. Instead, he received a daughter. The disappointment was polite but real, and Diana would later say she felt it linger in the air of her childhood, not as cruelty, but as a kind of invisible chill. Her parents eventually divorced when she was 6. In the England of the 1960s, divorce among the aristocracy was still spoken of in lowered voices. For Diana, it meant long car rides between houses, the confusion of loyalty, and the feeling that affection had to be earned. She adored both parents, but the custody battle placed her in the center of adult conflict. Her father won, and she remained with him at Althorp. Her mother remarried and moved abroad. Diana learned early that love could vanish suddenly, and that silence was the safest response. If her emotional world was uncertain, her social world was perfectly mapped. In upper-class Britain, children were trained in manners before they were taught multiplication. Discipline was a virtue, emotion a flaw. The phrase "stiff upper lip" was not a joke, but an instruction. Never show distress. Her father adored her, but rarely said so. He expressed love through order, clean uniforms, punctual meals, a quiet hand on the shoulder. For a sensitive child, it was both comforting and cold. Diana would later say that in her childhood no one hugged her. They gave gifts instead. At the time, this wasn't neglect, it was custom. To show affection openly was considered bad form. What mattered was composure. It was the same rule that guided the royal family, and one day it would stand between her and them like a wall of glass. The Spencers educated their children according to tradition. Boys went to elite boarding schools. Girls were sent to smaller, respectable institutions where they learned to ride, to write letters, and to smile correctly at tea. At 9, Diana was sent to a boarding school called Riddlesworth Hall. Her father cried when he left her there, but he left her all the same. That was what good parents were expected to do. For Diana, the separation felt like abandonment. In her dormitory, she kept 30 soft toys on her bed, small sentinels of comfort, but she could take only one to school. She chose a green hippopotamus, painted its eyes with glow-in-the-dark paint, and whispered to it at night. It's a small, almost childish image, yet it tells us much about who she was, a girl who fought fear with imagination. From the outside, everything looked proper. Her family was wealthy, her manners correct, her clothes impeccable. But behind the calm surface, she was learning the quiet art of hiding feelings, a skill that would later make her both convincing and fragile in front of cameras. In her teenage years, Diana's connection to Althorpe deepened. The house was enormous, 90 rooms, long corridors, and a gallery filled with ancestors. She liked to wander through it alone, touching the cool frames of portraits. Each face seemed to watch her, serious, elegant, slightly sad. Those silent witnesses carried the message every Spencer child absorbed. You are part of something larger than yourself. Your duty is to preserve it, not question it. By the time her father inherited the title and became the 8th Earl Spencer, Diana understood what that duty meant. It meant appearances. It meant keeping the family name clean, even when the heart was in turmoil. It meant hosting, smiling, standing straight. Later, as she entered royal life, she would try to follow the same rules and discover that they were impossible for someone who felt so deeply. Among the Spencers, there was pride, but also humor. They knew their history, yet they could laugh at it. Diana inherited that mixture, the instinct to charm and the impatience with solemnness. It's what made her at ease with ordinary people and uneasy with courtiers. She could talk to a gardener as easily as to a duke. Perhaps because, deep down, she remembered that her ancestors had once been closer to gardeners than to kings. So, when she later entered the royal family, she didn't see herself as climbing a ladder. She saw herself as joining a parallel house, one different in ceremony, but not necessarily superior in spirit. And that quiet confidence sometimes looked, to the Windsors, like defiance. In one of her last recorded conversations, Diana said she felt guided by her family's women, strong, stubborn, emotional. Her grandmother, Lady Fermoy, had been a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, a woman steeped in court etiquette. Yet even she warns Diana, before the engagement, that the royal way of life has a very different sense of humor, "I'm not sure it will suit you." It was meant kindly, but it was true. The warmth of the Spencers and the chill of the palace would never mix. Still, Diana carried her ancestry like a hidden talisman. Whenever the royal press turned cruel, she found comfort in remembering that her name was older than theirs. When she walked through public crowds, she walked with centuries behind her. And when she died, it was not in some royal chapel, but back at Althorpe, on an island surrounded by water lilies, in the place where the Spencers had always buried their own. In that sense, her story forms a circle. It begins with sheep and fields, rises to palaces, and returns to the quiet earth of Northamptonshire. And perhaps that is why her memory feels both intimate and vast. She belonged to history and to home at once, the girl from Althorpe who carried 500 years of England inside her, and who would, unknowingly, bring that old world to its knees. Every legend begins somewhere ordinary. For Diana, that place was a red brick house on the edge of a royal estate, Park House, Sandringham. If you walked past its garden hedge in the early 1960s, you might have heard nothing unusual. Children's laughter, the rattle of a bicycle on gravel, the distant hum of the church bells where the royal family attended service each Sunday. But inside that house lived a girl who would one day sit in those same pews as a princess and feel just as alone. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July, 1961. Her father, John, then known as Viscount Althorpe, worked as an equerry, a kind of royal aide to the Queen. Her mother, Frances Roche, was young, elegant, and full of energy. From the start, Diana's childhood was shaped by two powerful forces, privilege and distance. The Spencers were close enough to royalty to live within its orbit, yet far enough to remain ordinary in daily life. They saw the Queen at church, exchanged polite greetings, but went home to their own smaller routines. For Diana, this proximity created an early awareness of hierarchy. The royal family was near, but unreachable, like stars seen from the garden lawn. Family life, at least on the surface, followed the expected rhythm of upper-class England. Children were to be seen, not heard, meals were formal, feelings were private. Servants came and went, performing small miracles of order that made the household look calm even when it wasn't. What mattered most was composure, the ability to look fine no matter how you felt. But beneath that calm rhythm, something fragile was breaking. Diana's parents had lost a child before her birth, a baby boy who would have been the heir. The grief never healed. For her father, Diana's arrival brought both love and disappointment. He adored her, but she was not the son who would continue the line. In quiet moments, the air between them carried that unspoken truth. The tension grew over the years. Arguments became louder, silences longer. By the time Diana was 6, the marriage had collapsed. Her mother left with another man, and the family became divided by walls of pride and shame. In 1969, the divorce was finalized. A scandal in those days, especially among aristocrats who valued appearances above all. Diana later said that moment shaped her forever. She remembered standing on the stairs, listening to the shouting below, feeling both invisible and responsible. Children often believe they cause adult pain, and she was no exception. She grew up learning to sense moods instantly, to read a room the way others read a page. It would become one of her greatest gifts and one of her deepest wounds. After the divorce, her father won custody of the children. He moved them to Althorpe, the grand family estate in Northamptonshire. On the surface, it was paradise. Acres of green, swans on the lake, long corridors lined with portraits. But for a small girl who missed her mother, the grandeur only deepened the silence. Love existed, but it was locked inside politeness. Her father, affectionate in his way, found it hard to express tenderness. He showed care through routine, punctual dinners, tidy rooms, correct behavior. It was the language of his class, not of comfort. Diana once said that no one in her childhood hugged her. They bought her presents instead. That wasn't cruelty, it was the code of the English upper class. Emotional control was a sign of strength. Even joy had to be restrained. In that world, laughter was fine. Tears were not. Yet Diana was not made for restraint. From the beginning, she felt too much, loved too quickly, and cried too easily. Her governess called her a bundle of contradictions, shy yet loud, obedient yet impulsive. She would hide behind curtains to eavesdrop on adults, then burst out giggling when discovered. She could charm anyone, yet often retreated into long silences when hurt. That combination, vulnerability wrapped in charisma, never left her. At 9, her father sent her to boarding school, as was customary. The night before she left, she begged him not to send her away. He wept, then sent her anyway. That was the way things were done. In England's upper circles, independence was taught early, affection later, if at all. Riddlesworth Hall, the small girls' school she attended, looked like something from a storybook. Ivy on the walls, a sweeping lawn, the smell of chalk and polish. To outsiders, it seemed idyllic, but for a sensitive child, it could feel like exile. The days were regimented. Prayers, classes, cold walks before breakfast. Letters home were inspected for signs of homesickness. At night, lights went out early, and the building creaked like an old ship. Diana kept her toy hippopotamus on the pillow beside her, its painted eyes glowing faintly in the dark. When frightened, she whispered to it as if it could protect her. Other girls remember her as cheerful, kind, and sometimes mischievous. She loved to dance, to tell stories, to make people laugh. But they also remember how easily she cried when teased. Her classmates said she hated seeing anyone left out. She would share her sweets with the quietest child in the room. That instinct to comfort, even as a child, became a defining part of her nature. She wanted people to feel safe because she rarely did. When she came home for holidays, she filled Althorpe with noise again, music, chatter, the thud of her pony's hooves on the gravel path. Her father adored her vitality, but sometimes scolded her for being too emotional. The servants adored her too, though they whispered that she was lonely. Her older sisters were already grown. Her younger brother, Charles, was still small. Diana often wandered the house alone, exploring the endless rooms, as if searching for a voice that would answer hers. At school, she was not an academic star. She struggled with reading and failed her exams more than once. When she left Westheath School at 16, she had no qualifications to her name. It embarrassed her deeply. She felt stupid, and she wasn't. Her intelligence was emotional, not analytical, the kind that understands tone, not textbooks. But in the world she lived in, that didn't count as talent. After school, she spent a short time in Switzerland in what was politely called a finishing school. There, she learned to speak some French, to ski, and to set a dinner table correctly. Lessons for a life of appearances. But she hated being away from home, and returned early, restless and unsure of herself. Back in London, she began a small, quiet life. She cleaned the apartments of friends for pocket money, worked as a nanny, then found a job as a kindergarten assistant in a nursery school in Pimlico. It was the first time she felt genuinely useful. Children loved her instantly. She knelt to their level, listened to their stories, and laughed without reserve. No one cared about lineage or titles there. For the first time, her warmth was not a liability. It was a gift. People who knew her then describe her as sweet, a little clumsy, endlessly kind. She lived with friends in a shared flat, shopped for groceries, rode the bus. There was nothing glamorous about it. Her clothes were modest, her life ordinary. She seemed happy in her simplicity. But even then, something restless flickered inside her, a need to be noticed, to be loved, to belong completely to someone. That longing, born in childhood and sharpened by separation, would guide much of what came later. Diana often said she never got over the sound of her mother's car driving away. It left her with a fear of abandonment that surfaced again and again, in friendships, in marriage, even in the way she clung to public approval. The crowd became her parent, loud, unpredictable, but always there. There is a moment in almost every photograph of young Diana, the half smile, the slightly tilted head, eyes looking upward from beneath her fringe. It's a look that feels both open and guarded at once, as if she's testing whether it's safe to be seen. That look would one day enchant the world, but it began here, in the long corridors of Althorpe, where being watched was part of learning how to exist. Her upbringing was not cruel, but it was cold in a very English way. It taught her grace, composure, and the belief that suffering should be hidden. When she later stood before cameras, smiling through heartbreak, she was following the same lesson that had guided her childhood. Keep the upper lip firm. Smile no matter what. Don't let them see the tears. That control fascinated the public because it hid so much. Inside the most photographed woman on earth lived the same little girl who painted eyes on a toy hippopotamus to keep the dark away. She would spend the rest of her life balancing those two selves, the performer who smiled and the child who feared being left behind. Historians sometimes describe her as a symbol of emotional revolution, a woman who made it acceptable for the British to cry. But that understanding came later. As a child, she was simply learning the rules of survival in a world where emotion was unpolite. Every suppressed feeling gathered inside her, waiting for the moment when it would finally break through. In interviews, in hospital visits, in every tear the cameras would later capture. When she grew older, she tried to translate that childhood ache into care for others. The lonely girl became the listener, the comforter, the one who understood pain without words. That gift came not from training, but from longing. To comfort others was, for her, another way of comforting herself. And so, before Diana ever met a prince, before the world discovered her smile, the essential story had already been written. A sensitive child, shaped by silence and longing, growing up in the echo of privilege, learning early that love could vanish, that appearances mattered, and that kindness could sometimes open the only doors that felt safe. Everything that followed, the fame, the glamour, the tragedy, would grow from those roots. In the drawing rooms of Althorpe, surrounded by ancestors who seemed to stare down with perfect composure, a young girl was already preparing, without knowing it, for a life lived in public, a life where every glance, every word, every smile would be measured and misunderstood. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy of her upbringing. It gave her every skill to look perfect and none to feel safe. When Diana left school, she carried almost nothing tangible with her. No awards, no degrees, no plans. Only a restless curiosity about people and a quiet belief that life should feel warm. In the rigid world she came from, Warmth was a rare thing. At West Heath, her last boarding school, she had been affectionate but inconsistent. She loved sports, dance, and music, but struggled in lessons. Her teachers found her imaginative yet unfocused. She daydreamed during class, writing notes and sketches in the margins. When exam results came, they were disastrous. She failed them all. The news embarrassed her father, puzzled her teachers, and wounded her pride. She had watched her sisters pass the same exams with ease, move into fashionable jobs in magazines, and be praised for their poise. Diana was different, less polished, more impulsive. She didn't lack intelligence, she lacked concentration and confidence. One of her classmates later said that Diana felt emotions so strongly they crowded out thought. That intensity, which would later make her magnetic, made school unbearable. Her father tried to find a new direction for her. He sent her to Switzerland, to a finishing school on Lake Geneva. There, among polished manners and mountain views, young women were taught conversation, posture, and charm. The lessons were elegant but empty. Diana hated it. She wrote letters home complaining of loneliness and boredom. After one term, she returned to England, claiming she wanted to do something useful. It was a small rebellion, quiet but decisive. For the first time, she was choosing her own path. Back in London, she lived in her mother's flat for a while, then with friends in the city. It was a modest, shared apartment, a far cry from the corridors of Althorpe. She cleaned, cooked, and laughed loudly. The neighbors saw her carrying groceries, riding the bus, waving to strangers. To them, she was simply a tall, cheerful girl with big blue eyes and slightly clumsy grace. Few imagined she belonged to one of England's oldest families. She liked that anonymity. It gave her, for the first time, a taste of normal life. She needed work, but her failed exams limited her options. For a brief period, she cleaned apartments for wealthy friends of her family, tidying, dusting, earning pocket money. She later called it humbling but fun. Then she worked as a nanny, caring for children of family acquaintances. Her employers noticed how naturally she connected with them. She wasn't just responsible. She was warm. She knelt on the floor to play, listened to their stories, and never lost patience. One parent later said, "She made every child feel as if they were the most important person in the world." It was the first glimpse of what would become her lifelong pattern, a desire to nurture, to comfort, to fill emotional gaps that others left behind. In 1979, through friends, she found a part-time job as an assistant at a nursery school in Pimlico, the Young England Kindergarten. The building was small, bright, and noisy with laughter. Her salary was modest, barely enough to cover rent, but she loved the work. In that classroom, surrounded by paint-smeared aprons and tiny chairs, she felt free from comparison and judgment. She later said, "Children never ask who you are. They just want you to listen." Photographs from that time show a young woman crouched beside toddlers, smiling easily, hair slightly messy from play. There is no hint of the future princess, only gentleness and youth. Those who knew her remember her punctuality, her shy humor, and her deep empathy. She was the kind of person who would stay late to comfort a crying child or walk home with a friend who'd missed the bus. For a short time, her life was small but content. Outside work, she lived like any London 20-year-old, except that she rarely went to parties and didn't smoke or drink. She preferred quiet evenings, music, and long talks with her roommates. They teased her for being domestic. She cooked, cleaned, and left cheerful notes on the refrigerator. When she did go out, she dressed modestly: sweaters, long skirts, flats. The simplicity made her blend in and, ironically, made her more striking. Friends noticed that she longed for affection. She spoke often about her parents' divorce, about feeling unseen. She adored stories of romance, especially novels where love redeemed pain. Her favorite author was Barbara Cartland, whose sentimental tales of noble heroes and suffering heroines filled the shelves of British bedrooms. By coincidence, Cartland would later become her step-grandmother. It seemed almost symbolic. The fairy tale imagination folded back into real life. At the nursery, Diana's caring nature was obvious, but so was her uncertainty. She worried constantly about being not clever enough, not interesting enough, not good enough. The same insecurities that had haunted her at school followed her into adulthood. Her sisters were fashionable and confident. She still blushed when meeting strangers. When she was invited to social events, she often declined, afraid she wouldn't know what to say. And yet, even in her shyness, people felt drawn to her. She had a way of making awkwardness charming. She tilted her head when listening, laughed easily, and remembered small details about everyone she met. That natural empathy would soon become her greatest strength and her public image. In those years before fame, she was learning two important skills: how to read emotion and how to hide her own. Working with children taught her patience and attention. Life in London taught her to smile through uncertainty. Together, they formed the foundation of the persona that would soon capture the world's imagination. Looking back, it's easy to see how her early jobs prepared her for royal life, though not in the way anyone expected. They didn't teach her etiquette or diplomacy. They taught her intimacy. They taught her how to comfort strangers, how to notice pain without asking for explanation, and how to use kindness as language. Those were lessons no tutor could have planned. Still, beneath the calm surface, her old patterns remained. She fell quickly into emotional extremes, joy or sadness, nothing in between. Her friends said she was all heart. That intensity made her magnetic but fragile. In small ways, she sought validation, from praise, from laughter, from attention. She wanted to be loved completely, as if to fill an emptiness left long ago in Park House. That hunger would soon collide with the cold geometry of the royal world. It was around this time, late 1970s, that her life intersected briefly with that world again. Her family had long-standing ties with the Windsors. The Spencers' estate at Althorpe lay only a few hours from Sandringham, where the royal family spent holidays. They moved in the same circles, attended the same charity events. Diana's older sister Sarah had even dated Prince Charles for a short while. Through her, Diana had met him once or twice, casually, as a teenager. To her, he was a serious, polite man twice her age. Polite, but remote. She later said she thought him a bit of a sad man. He barely noticed her then. She was 16, bright and carefree, with little sense of destiny. Those early encounters seemed trivial at the time, but they lingered somewhere in the background, a reminder that the royal family was not entirely distant. When she walked past the newsstands filled with photographs of the prince, the polo matches, the charity balls, she saw not just a public figure, but someone who moved within the world her own family occasionally brushed against. It didn't seem impossible that their paths might cross again. In these quiet, in-between years, before cameras and crowds, Diana was still forming herself. She had no clear idea of her future, only vague wishes: to be loved, to have a family, to make people feel cared for. Her world was small but filled with possibility. A small flat, a modest job, and a sense that life was waiting just beyond the horizon. She later said those were the happiest months of her life, not because they were easy, but because they were real. There were no headlines, no photographers, no rehearsed gestures. Only mornings with children's laughter and evenings filled with chatter and ordinary dreams. But history rarely lets ordinary happiness last long. By 1979, the press had begun following Prince Charles's romantic life with obsessive interest. He was in his early 30s, still unmarried, and the country was impatient for a royal wedding. His circle of friends included several of Diana's, and soon the girl who taught nursery school children to paint with their fingers would find herself, unexpectedly, under the same light as the future king. For now, though, she was just Diana Spencer, 20, untested, gentle, slightly awkward, walking through London streets with a bag of groceries and a heart full of quiet longing. No one, least of all her, could imagine how quickly her life would change. If we pause here, just before history notices her, we can see the delicate balance that defined her. A woman who felt ordinary, yet carried the weight of extraordinary expectations. She was not ambitious for fame, she was ambitious for love. And when love came dressed as destiny, she accepted it with the innocence of someone who still believed in fairy tales. That innocence, so luminous and fragile, would become both her crown and her curse. By the end of the 1970s, Prince Charles was one of the most eligible bachelors in the world, and perhaps one of the most scrutinized. He was 30, heir to a 1,000-year crown, and still unmarried. Each month, the tabloids speculated about his latest companion, a debutante, a countess, a singer, a friend. His romantic life had become a matter of national concern, as if the stability of Britain itself depended on his choice. The truth was simpler and sadder. Charles was thoughtful, awkward, and far more comfortable with books than parties. He had known love, genuine love, in his 20s, with a woman named Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles. But she had married another man, and the royal family quietly made it clear that she was unsuitable for the heir to the throne. Charles obeyed. He usually did. As the years passed, his family's patience wore thin. The Queen Mother teased him about settling down. The press mocked his indecision. His father, Prince Philip, began to nudge him more firmly. You must marry a suitable girl, and soon. Suitable meant young, well-born, discreet, Protestant, and preferably inexperienced enough not to cause scandal. In this narrowing field of expectation, one name began to surface: Diana Spencer. She was 19, charming, and from an impeccable family. Her sister had once dated him. The families already knew each other. And when Charles saw her again at a country weekend in 1980, he found her different from the loud debutantes who filled royal calendars. She was shy, gentle, slightly nervous, and she listened. He invited her to the races, then to a family gathering at Balmoral, the royal estate in Scotland. Each meeting was surrounded by reporters, though at first no one realized what was happening. When the press finally caught sight of her, everything changed. For Diana, the attention was dizzying. One week, she was a nursery assistant taking the bus to work. The next, her face was on every front page. Photographers waited outside her flat, calling her name, following her to the shop, the school, the car. Neighbors peeked from windows, curious about the girl the prince was serious about. In those early days, she tried to see it as a game. She smiled, hid behind handbags, laughed at the absurdity of it all. But inside, she was terrified. She confided to friends that she was falling in love. Charles seemed gentle, protective, slightly melancholy, the perfect contrast to her own uncertainty. He spoke softly, sent flowers, called her darling. When he invited her to Balmoral again to meet the royal family properly, she accepted eagerly. The visit was both a test and a trap. Balmoral, surrounded by misty hills and rivers, was the royal family's most private refuge and its most traditional. Guests were expected to adapt instantly to its rules: early breakfasts, long walks, proper dress, punctuality, modesty. Most visitors found it intimidating. Diana, however, won them over. She laughed at Prince Philip's jokes, played with the Queen's dogs, and admired the Scottish reign without complaint. The Queen found her a delightful girl. Philip called her a breath of fresh air. Everyone agreed she would make a perfect princess. What no one asked was whether she wanted to become one. In truth, Diana was both enchanted and overwhelmed. She later said she felt she was being assessed like a racehorse. She was eager to please, to say the right things, wear the right clothes, behave exactly as expected. Every compliment from the royal family felt like approval from history itself. She returned to London glowing with pride, convinced that she and Charles were meant for each other. Charles, meanwhile, was under growing pressure. He was fond of her, perhaps even moved by her warmth, but he was not in love. His heart still belonged, quietly, to Camilla. Yet the press had already decided the story for him. The Prince of Wales had found his bride. The narrative moved faster than his feelings. When his father reminded him that he couldn't string the girl along, Charles took it as a command. A few weeks later, he proposed. The moment was strangely unromantic. They were sitting in the nursery of Windsor Castle, where Charles had been visiting his mother. He asked, awkwardly, "Will you marry me?" Diana laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then she saw his expression and realized it wasn't. She said yes. He kissed her on the cheek and said, "You're a lucky girl." Then he left for an overseas trip. It was February 1981 when the engagement was announced to the world. Diana was barely 20. The official photograph showed them standing side by side. She in a bright blue suit, he in a matching tie. When a reporter asked if they were in love, Diana answered shyly, "Of course." Charles smiled thinly and said, "Whatever 'in love' means." The words were meant as a joke, but they settled like a shadow over the entire marriage. From that day, her life ceased to belong to her. She moved from her small flat to Clarence House under the care of royal staff. Her telephone was monitored, her outings restricted. An aide told her, gently but firmly, "Your life will never be the same again." It was meant as advice. It sounded like a warning. The weeks that followed were a blur of fittings, rehearsals, and press briefings. She was taught how to curtsy, how to exit a car gracefully, how to hold flowers without looking awkward. No one taught her how to survive isolation. At night, in her vast new rooms, she cried quietly. She later said, "I felt like a lamb to the slaughter." But the world saw only smiles. The media frenzy became relentless. Cameras followed her everywhere, shopping, driving, even standing at her window. When she stepped outside, flashes erupted like lightning. She tried to joke with them, to be friendly. The friendliness only encouraged them. Within months, she was the most photographed woman in Britain, though she had not yet become a princess. During this period, the first signs of strain appeared. Charles was busy with official duties. She felt abandoned. When they did meet, their conversations were polite but distant. She sensed that something, or someone, stood between them. One day, while visiting his office, she found a package containing a gold bracelet engraved with the letters G and F. She would later say those letters stood for Gladys and Fred. the secret nicknames of Charles and Camilla. He insisted it was just an old friendship, but Diana never believed him. From that moment, the idea of betrayal took root, and it would never leave her. Meanwhile, the royal household moved forward as if everything were perfect. The wedding was set for July 29, 1981, the grandest ceremony Britain had seen in a century. The press called it the wedding of the century. 750 million people would watch on television. 27 wedding cakes were baked. The guest list included emperors, presidents, and prime ministers. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale come true. But behind the closed doors of Clarence's house, Diana's anxiety deepened. She struggled with insomnia and drastic weight loss. Her dressmakers had to keep narrowing the waist of her gown as the weeks passed. Later, she would reveal that this was the beginning of her battle with bulimia, a silent attempt to control the only thing she could, her own body. She also began to sense that she had no ally inside the palace. When she confided her fears, the answers were polite but firm. "You'll be fine, dear." Every girl feels nervous before her wedding. But Diana's nerves were not ordinary. She felt trapped, watched, and utterly alone. One evening, she overheard Charles on the phone speaking softly to someone. She believed it was Camilla. She confronted him. He denied it. The argument ended with tears. The next morning, photographers caught her leaving the palace, eyes red, but smiling as always. That photograph appeared on front pages the next day, proof, they said, of bridal excitement. No one guessed the truth. As the wedding approached, London transformed into a stage set. Flags hung from windows, shopkeepers sold souvenirs, and news anchors rehearsed lines about a new era for the monarchy. Diana's face appeared on plates, mugs, and tea towels. She was already an icon before she had spoken a single word in public. The night before the wedding, she slept poorly. In the morning, she dressed in a silk gown with 25 feet of train and 30,000 pearls sewn by hand. The tiara glittered under the lights of St. Paul's Cathedral. The crowd outside roared, a wave of sound that seemed to lift her into another world. Her heart was pounding, but she smiled. She always smiled. As she walked down the aisle, the music of trumpets echoed through the dome. 2,000 guests stood, millions watched on television. She made a small mistake in the vows, reversing the order of Charles's names. The press called it endearing. Only she knew how much her hands were trembling. When the ceremony ended, they stepped onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace and kissed. The moment replayed endlessly ever since. To the world, it was the kiss of a fairy tale. To her, it was the beginning of a story she didn't yet understand. In the days that followed, commentators described her as radiant, glowing, the new face of the monarchy. Children waved flags, souvenir shops sold out. The illusion was perfect. Only Diana knew how hollow it felt. The man beside her was kind but distant. Her new family treated her with courteous formality. The palace, with its vast rooms and silent corridors, felt less like a home than a museum. She would later say, "I was the happiest girl in the world on paper and the loneliest in reality." Looking back, the engagement and wedding reveal everything that made her story both magical and tragic. A young woman seeking love entered a system that valued composure over affection. A prince seeking stability chose a woman he barely knew. And the public, hungry for romance, turned them into symbols they could never live up to. What neither of them realized was that they were not just marrying each other. They were marrying an idea. the fantasy of perfect monarchy in an age that no longer believed in perfection. The cameras that crowned them would soon become their judges, and the girl who once hid behind a handbag from photographers would soon learn that there was nowhere left to hide. For a few shining weeks in the summer of 1981, Britain seemed to hold its breath. The streets were full of flags, church bells rang endlessly, and strangers smiled at one another on buses. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, offering sunlight as if the heavens themselves approved. The royal wedding was more than a ceremony. The monarchy, weary after years of formality and scandal, suddenly looked young again. A new princess had arrived, and the people adored her. But fairy tales have one peculiar quality. They end exactly when real life begins. After the wedding, Diana became Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales. She was barely 20 years old, younger than many of her attendants. Her first days of married life were spent in an unfamiliar world, a world of palaces, servants, schedules, and silence. Her new home, Highgrove House in Gloucestershire, was beautiful but cold. Its gardens were impeccable, its corridors echoing. She decorated a few rooms with soft fabrics and flowers, trying to make them feel warm. But warmth was something the royal system did not value. Her husband was kind in small ways, polite, attentive when present, but he was often absent. Official duties filled his calendar. Charity events, military visits, speeches, tours. When they did spend time together, they seemed to live on parallel tracks, bound by ceremony, but separated by temperament. Charles was intellectual, disciplined, deeply attached to his routines. Diana was spontaneous, emotional, and easily wounded. He enjoyed long talks about architecture and philosophy. She longed for affection and laughter. Each mistook the other's nature for indifference. In the early months of marriage, she tried hard to adapt. She practiced small talk for diplomatic dinners, learned the order of precedence, memorized names of ambassadors. The Queen advised patience. Courtiers offered polite smiles. But nothing in her upbringing, not Althorpe, not finishing school, had prepared her for a life so structured and solitary. There were rules for everything: how to enter a room, where to sit, when to speak. Every gesture was watched, every word reported. In public, she smiled brilliantly. In private, she cried. The pressure was unrelenting. Every day began with the sound of cameras. Paparazzi camped outside their gates, waiting for any glimpse, a wave, a misstep, a hint of emotion. When she looked tired, they called her moody. When she smiled too widely, they called her frivolous. The young woman who had once taken buses to her nursery job was now followed by dozens of cars every time she left the palace. Freedom vanished overnight. The first royal tour, a short visit to Wales, revealed both her gift and her curse. Crowds lined the streets, shouting her name, waving flags and flowers. When she stepped forward to greet them, her warmth seemed genuine and effortless. She made eye contact, laughed easily, and knelt to speak to children. The people loved her instantly. They shouted not Prince Charles, but Diana. For the monarchy, this was both a triumph and a warning. For the first time, the heir to the throne was overshadowed by his wife. At home, the strain grew. The couple had little privacy. Royal duties separated them. Emotional distance widened the gap. Charles retreated into work, into hobbies, into quiet phone calls to old friends. Diana, feeling abandoned, turned inward. Food became her comfort and punishment. She would eat secretly, then force herself to be sick, a ritual born of anxiety and control. It was the beginning of bulimia, an illness she would battle for years. She later said, "It was my cry for help, but no one was listening." The palace, unaccustomed to such confessions, dismissed it as nerves. In that world, emotion was treated like weather, something to be endured, not discussed. When she fainted during a public engagement, courtiers whispered about diet, not despair. To admit vulnerability was considered weakness. So she smiled and continued. Her only real solace came during visits to hospitals and schools. Children recognized something in her that adults ignored, a softness that felt safe. She began to prefer those visits to official banquets. While others saw photo opportunities, she saw people. A touch on a patient's hand, a genuine question to a nurse, these moments made her feel human again. But her growing empathy also revealed a quiet rebellion. She was beginning to define her role on her own terms. By late 1981, she was pregnant. The news thrilled the nation. Headlines called it the royal heir. Inside the palace, relief mingled with celebration. A child would stabilize the marriage, they hoped. Diana's happiness, however, was fragile. She suffered from severe morning sickness, so severe that she was hospitalized. The tabloids, mistaking drama for devotion, followed every detail. When she emerged from the hospital, pale and smiling, the crowd cheered. No one noticed her trembling hands. Pregnancy also brought deeper loneliness. Charles continued his duties, often away for days. At one point, he chose to attend a polo match instead of staying with her before an important medical appointment. She never forgot that. Her need for reassurance met his need for order, and the two never matched. When Prince William was born in June 1982, the country erupted in joy. The image of the young mother on the hospital steps, cradling her baby wrapped in white, became iconic. For a moment, the fairy tale seemed real again. Her smile looked genuine, and perhaps it was, but even that scene had its quiet pain. Charles had wanted the baby's name to reflect royal tradition. She preferred something simple, human. She chose William. He agreed reluctantly. It was one of many small disagreements that hinted at deeper divides. Motherhood transformed her. For the first time since childhood, she felt a sense of unconditional love. She doted on William, spending hours with him instead of leaving him to nannies as custom dictated. The royal household frowned on such behavior. The Queen preferred emotional distance, even with her own children. But Diana insisted. She took William on trips, played on the floor with him, laughed without restraint. For her, this was not rebellion, it was healing. Her connection with the public only deepened. People saw her as modern, relatable, and kind. Her every gesture, a hug, a glance, a tear, seemed to bridge the gap between monarchy and ordinary life. Newspapers began to call her the People's Princess. The title was affectionate but double-edged. It drew admiration from the world and quiet resentment from within the palace. Charles, though proud in public, began to feel eclipsed. He had spent his life preparing to be king. Now he was being introduced as Diana's husband. The contrast between their receptions on royal tours was painful. In Australia, crowds screamed her name. When he spoke, they listened politely. When she waved, they roared. Cameras followed her every move. He joked about it in interviews, but the wound was real. The marriage, already fragile, began to bend under the weight of comparison. Meanwhile, the press narrative grew louder. Stories of tension leaked constantly. Some true, some invented. Paparazzi followed her even during private moments. They captured her tears, her glances, her silences. Every expression was analyzed as proof of either bliss or despair. The young woman who once hid from photographers now found them unavoidable. She once said, "I felt as if every minute of my life was being watched, and every mistake would last forever." Within the palace, isolation deepened. She had few friends she could trust. Most courtiers saw her as a charming distraction, not as an equal partner in royal duty. Her emotional openness, once celebrated, was now whispered about as instability. Charles grew colder, turning more often to old confidants, including Camilla. Diana sensed it. Each polite dinner became an exercise in self-control. She began to describe herself privately as two people, one on the outside, one inside. The outside was radiant, smiling, flawless in every photograph. The inside was frightened, restless, and yearning for affection. The gap between the two grew wider each year. Yet through that pain, she began to discover something important. Her compassion, the quality mocked as weakness inside the palace, was her greatest power outside it. The public saw sincerity in her gestures, not performance. When she visited a child with cancer or shook hands with an AIDS patient, she did it naturally, without calculation. Those small acts began to redefine the image of royalty itself. In that sense, even her suffering served a purpose. It made her more human, and through her, the monarchy appeared more human too. But the cost was immense. By the mid-1980s, the fairy tale had faded. The marriage that had begun with trumpets was now a quiet arrangement of parallel lives. They shared duties, children, and appearances, but not intimacy. Still, the world continued to project its dreams onto her. Magazines praised her beauty, designers begged her to wear their creations, and children named dolls after her. Every dress she wore was analyzed, every smile was news. She once said, "I wasn't treated like a person, I was treated like an act." But she also knew that without that act, she would have no voice. So she played her part, with grace, with charm, and with a growing awareness that the audience loved the performer more than the story. By the end of those early years, the contrast was complete. On the outside, she was the most famous woman in the world, young, beautiful, adored. On the inside, she was lonely and uncertain, still searching for the simple affection she had missed as a child. The cameras captured the surface perfectly. Only she could feel what lay beneath. The fairy tale had fulfilled its promise. The girl had become a princess. But, as with all fairy tales, the spell came with a price. The woman inside the crown was slowly disappearing behind her own image. The royal family often calls itself the firm. It's not a nickname of affection, it's a description of function. Like a company, it runs on duty, precision, and routine. Everyone has a role. Everyone knows their place. Emotion, like inefficiency, is quietly discouraged. When Diana entered that world, she entered something far older than herself, a living institution designed to outlast personalities. It was a place where tradition was both protection and prison. To survive within it required a kind of emotional camouflage. Those who lasted learned to smile at pain, to hide warmth behind ritual, to turn private feeling into public gesture. Diana had never learned that language. At first, she tried. She followed every rule, every formality. She curtsied correctly, greeted dignitaries, memorized the endless hierarchy of titles. But she soon discovered that behind the gold and ceremony lay a vast, echoing quiet. a world of corridors, meetings, and distance. It wasn't cruelty that defined it, it was absence. Her days were carefully planned. Mornings began with briefings, followed by visits, receptions, and official photographs. Afternoons were for correspondence or charity meetings. Evenings often meant formal dinners, where small talk replaced conversation. Every moment was choreographed, every gesture. There was no space for spontaneity, no space, really, for being herself. In that setting, Diana's natural warmth stood out, and not always in a welcome way. She laughed too easily, spoke too openly, and seemed too human for an environment that prized restraint. Courtiers murmured about her unpredictability. Newspapers celebrated the same quality as charm. Inside the palace, charm was a risk, a reminder that the public might love her more than the institution itself. She began to notice subtle things. The way conversations paused when she entered a room, the faint impatience in certain advisors, the cold courtesy that replaced companionship. She wasn't an equal. She was an outsider who had entered a centuries-old club. Her title gave her status, not belonging. Charles, who had grown up within that system, didn't notice what she was enduring. He saw structure as stability. She saw it as suffocation. When she tried to explain her unhappiness, he grew defensive. He had lived under the same pressures all his life, yet never complained. Why couldn't she do the same? But Diana didn't want endurance. She wanted empathy. And that was something the royal system rarely gave. Loneliness settled over her like fog. She once said, "You'd be surprised how lonely it is, even in a crowd." The vast palaces amplified the feeling. At night, she wandered the halls of Kensington Palace after everyone had gone to bed, switching on lights just to hear another sound. She wrote letters to friends, but every word risked leaking to the press. Privacy, the thing she craved most, no longer existed. Yet within that loneliness, something began to change. The same sensitivity that made her suffer also made her perceptive. She began to see how isolated the monarchy was, not only from her, but from the people it ruled. While courtiers worried about etiquette, she worried about emotion. When she visited hospitals or charities, she noticed how people softened when she spoke to them directly. They didn't bow or curtsy in fear. They relaxed, smiled, and talked. She realized her difference could be a strength. In those early years, her natural empathy clashed constantly with the royal code. She wanted to hug people. She was told to shake hands. She wanted to speak honestly. She was advised to stay silent. Even her clothing became a battlefield. Bright colors and bold patterns delighted the palace, where moderation was virtue. She learned, slowly, that even kindness could be seen as defiance. Her first serious confrontation with the firm came after William's birth. Diana wanted to raise him herself, not leave him entirely to nannies and tutors. She brought him on royal tours, nursed him, and insisted on doing everyday tasks, things no royal mother had done in generations. Her aides were horrified. They warned her that it wasn't appropriate, but she persisted, saying quietly, "I don't want my children to grow up without love the way I did." It was a small act of rebellion, but it marked the beginning of her independence. Behind the scenes, the press became both weapon and companion. Diana understood its power instinctively. She had grown up surrounded by cameras. Now she began to use them deliberately. When she felt ignored by the palace, she smiled brighter for the photographers. The public saw a happy princess. The palace saw a restless one. Each reaction widened the gap between them. The queen, reserved by nature, found her daughter-in-law difficult to read. She admired Diana's popularity, but worried about her unpredictability. In private meetings, she urged patience and discretion, advice that Diana took to heart but never fully mastered. Prince Philip, blunt and practical, offered his own counsel. "You're not a movie star, my dear. You're part of a system." But that was exactly the problem. Diana didn't want to be part of a system. She wanted to be part of a relationship. By the mid-1980s, she began to notice how the royal machinery closed ranks around Charles. His advisors, many of them lifelong servants of the crown, treated her as secondary, young, emotional, unreliable. When she tried to voice her concerns, they were dismissed as nerves or inexperience. Each dismissal deepened her mistrust. She began to feel that the institution was protecting him, not them. She turned increasingly to outsiders for comfort: friends, staff, journalists, therapists. To the palace, this seemed reckless. To her, it was survival. Her private secretary later said, "She needed affection the way others need air." That hunger for connection made her vulnerable, not only to gossip, but to manipulation. The more she reached out, the more the system retreated. Her relationship with Charles grew formal. They fulfilled duties side by side, but rarely spoke with intimacy. When tension flared, he withdrew into his old friendship with Camilla. Diana suspected it, confronted it, and was met with silence. The silence hurt more than any confession could have. She once told a friend, "I was fighting a system, not a person, but the system had faces I loved." Inside the palace, people began to whisper that she was unstable. They described her mood swings, her tears, her bulimia. Few considered that these were responses to isolation. In an institution built on control, vulnerability looked like weakness. And weakness, in that world, was unforgivable. Despite the tension, her public role continued to expand. She became a fashion icon, a symbol of modernity, a global figure in her own right. Foreign leaders requested her presence at events. Crowds cheered louder for her than for anyone else in the royal entourage. To the palace, this was both asset and threat. The monarchy needed her glow, but feared its intensity. She began to sense that she was being used, displayed for charm, silenced for substance. Whenever she spoke candidly, she was reminded that princesses don't explain themselves. But the world outside wanted explanation. People were fascinated not only by her beauty, but by her visible emotion. The way she sometimes seemed near tears, the way her smiles carried shadows. They saw truth in her imperfections. And in loving her humanity, they began to question the inhuman perfection of monarchy itself. That shift, from reverence to curiosity, from distance to intimacy, frightened the palace. For centuries, the crown had survived by being mysterious. Diana made it feel real, and reality is always messy. The system around her wasn't designed for messiness. It was designed for endurance. Still, she endured, and in her own quiet way, she adapted. She learned to navigate the courtiers, to use charm as shield, to sense which rooms were safe and which were not. She cultivated allies among staff and journalists, not out of vanity, but out of need. When she felt voiceless inside the palace, she found her voice outside it. Every photograph, every interview, every smile became part of her own narrative, one she controlled, at least partially. The more the palace tried to contain her, the more the world reached for her. Children sent letters. Hospitals invited her. Ordinary people began to see her not as a princess from a storybook, but as someone who understood their pain. That identification, the feeling that she was one of them, became a quiet revolution in itself. For the first time, a member of the royal family seemed emotionally accessible. And once the public tasted that intimacy, there was no going back. Inside the royal system, that intimacy felt dangerous. It blurred the line between royalty and celebrity. To the Queen's generation, the two were opposites. To Diana's, they were becoming the same. She lived at the intersection, half symbol, half person, and the collision would soon consume her. Looking back, it's tempting to see those palace years as a slow-motion tragedy, but they were also a kind of education. Diana entered the monarchy as a romantic. She emerged as a realist. She learned how power hides behind manners, how silence can wound more deeply than words, and how a smile can be both armor and invitation. By the late 1980s, the royal family still presented a perfect picture: the prince, the princess, and their two sons. Photographs from that era remain luminous: skiing holidays, family portraits, summer parades. But the light in those images hides the cracks. Behind the balcony smiles stood two people trapped in incompatible worlds. One ruled by duty, the other by feeling. Diana once said, "I realized that I was good at being royal, but I didn't want to play the game." The problem was that the game had no exit. Inside the royal system, there was only one acceptable posture: obedience. And obedience, for her, felt like erasure. If the palace was her prison, the people were her escape. From the moment she stepped into crowds, something electric yet gentle happened. The formality that froze others seemed to melt around her. Security officers called it the Diana effect, the instant softening of faces, the collective intake of breath, the reaching of hands through barriers just to touch her glove. But what looked like charm to the public was to her instinct. She had spent her childhood learning to sense emotion in a room, to feel loneliness, tension, fear. Now, in hospitals and schools, she used that same sensitivity to bridge distance. She never needed scripts or briefings. She simply looked people in the eye and listened. In 1983, she joined Charles on a 6-week tour of Australia and New Zealand. It was meant to be a showcase for the young couple, his experience, her beauty. But from the moment they landed, the balance shifted. The crowds were enormous, and they shouted one name, not two. Children pushed forward for her smile. Mothers reached out to touch her hand. When she bent down to greet a little girl who offered flowers, cameras captured the moment: a princess kneeling to a child. It seemed small, but it broke centuries of tradition. Royalty was supposed to be admired from afar, not approached. Diana erased that distance with a single gesture. Even Charles noticed. When he addressed an audience, the cheers were polite. When she appeared, they became wild. He joked about it, but the humor carried strain. The tour that was meant to strengthen their image as a couple instead revealed their difference. She moved by feeling, he moved by formality. The people sensed it. For them, Diana was not just royal, she was human. The media amplified that image. Newspapers called her the people's princess. Photographers followed her everywhere, capturing both glamour and vulnerability. Magazines studied her fashion choices, her gestures, her motherhood. Every photo of her holding William or laughing with a child became proof of authenticity, a new kind of royalty, emotional and modern. But authenticity, when televised, becomes performance. Soon her sincerity was consumed by demand. Every hospital visit required cameras. Every smile was news. She didn't resist, at least not yet, because those visits gave her purpose. Amid the rigid world of protocol, here she felt useful. Her empathy, which once embarrassed the palace, became her identity. When Harry was born in 1984, she felt complete. 2 sons, a family of her own. She poured herself into motherhood with the same intensity that she gave to strangers. She wanted her boys to know love, not ceremony. She took them on amusement rides, to homeless shelters, to hospital wards. Once, she let them queue for ice cream with other children, a scene that horrified royal staff but delighted the public. Her reasoning was simple. They need to see the world as it really is. Her approach to parenting clashed with royal tradition. Charles preferred order, scheduled visits, planned lessons, well-dressed appearances. Diana preferred messiness, bedtime cuddles, laughter, surprise. The boys adored her, but the difference in parenting styles mirrored the growing emotional divide between their parents. Photographs from that period, the family skiing in Switzerland, smiling on the palace balcony, still show unity. But behind the smiles, the silence had deepened. Her public work continued to evolve. At first, she was assigned safe causes, children's hospitals, ballet companies, fashion charities. But her attention soon turned to places others avoided: wards for cancer patients, hospices, shelters for the homeless. She had no medical training, no grand speeches prepared. She simply sat beside people, held their hands, listened to their stories. One nurse recalled her saying, "I don't bring miracles, I bring understanding." It was in these moments that Diana found both escape and identity. The palace gave her titles, the people gave her meaning. When she walked through hospital corridors, she wasn't a princess under scrutiny. She was a woman doing something real. And that reality, so rare in royal life, sustained her. Yet even this gift had its cost. The more she connected with the public, the more the palace closed around her. Her independence unsettled those who valued control. Her schedule became a point of tension. Her growing fame a quiet threat. Some officials whispered that she was too emotional for royal work. Others accused her of attention-seeking. But Diana didn't seek attention for its own sake. She sought affection, understanding, and truth. And the public, hungry for authenticity, responded. By the mid-1980s, her image had surpassed anything the monarchy had seen. She was a global figure, photographed with world leaders, movie stars, children, and refugees. Her dresses set trends across continents. Her face sold magazines overnight. But fame, as always, blurred boundaries. She began to lose the separation between her true self and her reflection in the media. The world adored the image, but she still struggled with the loneliness beneath it. At home, the gap between her and Charles had become unbridgeable. He immersed himself in his charities and in private correspondence with Camilla. She found comfort in friends, some loyal, some opportunistic. Rumors began to circulate. Affairs, arguments, secret quarrels. The press, once her ally, became her shadow. Still, she carried on with remarkable discipline. Her bulimia persisted, but she began therapy and sought help. She threw herself into new causes: mental health, domestic abuse, AIDS. At the time, these were considered controversial subjects for a royal to address. The palace worried they were too modern, too political. She ignored the warnings. Her logic was simple: people need to feel seen. In 1987, she visited a London hospital treating patients with AIDS. Public fear of the disease was at its peak. Myths and stigma surrounded it. When the cameras rolled, Diana did something quietly radical. She shook hands with a patient, without gloves. That image circled the world. It said more than any speech could. Compassion was stronger than fear. She later explained, "It's the contact that heals." In that moment, a centuries-old institution looked modern. not because it wanted to, but because she made it so. Her approach transformed how the public viewed charity. It wasn't about distant patronage anymore. It was about presence, touch, and humanity. Diana turned sympathy into action. And in doing so, she began to separate her identity from the institution that had once defined her. By the late 1980s, she had become two figures at once: the royal emissary representing the crown, and the global humanitarian representing herself. The distinction mattered deeply, especially to the monarchy, which feared the latter. But for ordinary people, the difference didn't matter. They saw in her something that had been missing from public life: sincerity. Every generation chooses its symbols. For the 1980s, an age of glamour and greed, Diana embodied empathy. She represented vulnerability in a time that worshipped strength, warmth in a culture of surfaces. When she smiled, it seemed real. When she cried, it felt shared. In her, the public found both beauty and brokenness, the rare combination that makes someone unforgettable. Still, fame has its gravity. The same cameras that once celebrated her now hunted her. Paparazzi hid in hedges, followed cars, invaded holidays. She laughed about it sometimes, even used them when it suited her, but the constant attention eroded her sense of self. She later said, "I became good at seeing myself as others saw me, and I lost the rest." The contradiction of her life deepened. Her greatest strength, emotional openness, was also her greatest vulnerability. It drew people in, but it also exposed her pain. The palace viewed that exposure as undignified. The public saw it as honesty. In that gap between two value systems, Diana lived, performing the impossible task of being both real and royal. Through her children and her charity work, she had found fragments of freedom. But freedom inside a system built on control always has consequences. Her independence, her growing fame, her instinctive empathy, all of it challenged the foundations of monarchy itself. Because for centuries, the royal family had survived by staying distant, untouchable. Diana had brought it back to earth, and once the world had tasted that closeness, there was no returning to mystery. She didn't plan to start a revolution. She only wanted connection. But connection, multiplied by millions, becomes change. And that change, quietly and irresistibly, had already begun. By the end of the 1980s, the fairy tale was long gone. The smiles remained, the tours continued, but behind every polished photograph lived exhaustion. The world saw perfection. Those inside it felt fracture. The marriage of the century had become, quietly, a competition for sympathy, for control, for survival. To the outside world, the royal couple still represented stability. They appeared together at ceremonies, waved from balconies, attended state dinners. But even in photographs, their body language told another story. He looked ahead. She looked elsewhere. They had learned to perform unity, not to feel it. The stagecraft was flawless. The intimacy was gone. Charles and Diana had grown into opposite directions. He retreated into intellectual projects, architecture, organic farming, philosophy. She threw herself into humanitarian work and the emotional energy of crowds. Each found fulfillment where the other felt lost. Their schedules, once shared, now rarely overlapped. Their conversations grew polite, then distant, then silent. Rumors followed them everywhere. The tabloids, once their allies, began to sense blood. Every glance, every gesture was photographed, exaggerated, and sold. If she looked sad, headlines screamed "Princess in tears." If she smiled, they whispered, "New secret love." Diana's fame had become a trap. The public who adored her also consumed her pain as entertainment. In this pressure, her old insecurities returned, sharper than before. She struggled with bulimia, depression, and sleeplessness. Therapists were summoned and dismissed. The palace treated her distress as inconvenience. She once said, "I was asking for help, but they heard it as drama." It wasn't drama, it was despair. Feeling unheard at home, she sought comfort elsewhere, in friendships that crossed the invisible boundaries of palace life. Among them was her bodyguard, Barry Manicky. He was kind, direct, and unpretentious, everything the royal world was not. He listened without judgment, treated her as a person, not a title. Rumors began to swirl about the nature of their closeness. The palace reassigned him quietly. Months later, he died in a motorcycle accident. Diana was devastated. She told a friend, "It was the biggest blow of my life." Whether their relationship was romantic or not remains uncertain. What mattered was that he had given her something rare, sincerity. And now it was gone. Charles, meanwhile, had drifted back into regular contact with Camilla Parker Bowles. Their friendship never truly ended. Now it became a lifeline for him. He found in her understanding, loyalty, and shared history, things his marriage no longer offered. When Diana discovered the depth of that bond, the pain became unbearable. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the realization that she had been chosen not for love, but for role. "I was part of a plan," she said later, "and plans can't love you back." Arguments became routine. Sometimes they ended in silence, sometimes in tears, sometimes in destruction. Smashed plates, slammed doors, long hours of isolation. Their staff walked on eggshells. Each blamed the other for the media's cruelty. Diana accused Charles of neglect. Charles accused Diana of manipulation. In truth, both were victims of the same impossible expectations. The monarchy demanded symbols, not humans. But both had remained human, and the cost was public humiliation. The press, sensing tension, began its long siege. They followed her car, camped outside her gym, hounded her friends. Newspapers offered fortunes for exclusive interviews, photographs, or gossip. Every phone call risked interception. Every private word risked publication. The palace advised silence. She began to realize silence was a weapon used against her. So she decided, slowly, to speak. In the early 1990s, she began cooperating with journalist Andrew Morton. Their collaboration would produce one of the most explosive books in modern royal history, Diana, Her True Story. To protect herself, she didn't meet him directly. Instead, she recorded hours of secret audio tapes, answering questions through a trusted intermediary. Her voice on those tapes is soft, steady, occasionally trembling. She spoke about her loneliness, her bulimia, her suicide attempts, and the three of us in the marriage. She described Charles's relationship with Camilla as an open wound that never healed. "I cried my eyes out," she said. "I didn't think I was good enough, but I couldn't give up." When the book appeared in 1992, it detonated like a bomb. The royal family called it betrayal. The public called it revelation. For the first time, the glossy illusion shattered. The world saw not a perfect princess, but a woman suffering inside the palace walls. Her pain humanitized her even further and isolated her completely. She had broken the unspoken rule: never explain, never complain. Charles responded in kind, though more subtly. Leaked stories began appearing about Diana's volatility, her alleged affairs, her temper. A war of image had begun, quiet at first, then open. Each side used the media as mirror and weapon. For the tabloids, it was gold. For the monarchy, it was poison. In public, she remained radiant. Her charity work expanded, her visits became more daring. She walked through minefields, sat beside lepers, embraced AIDS patients. Each act drew admiration abroad and unease at home. The Queen's advisors complained that she was acting alone. But Diana's reply was simple. If I waited for permission, I'd never do anything. In that defiance lay both her strength and her danger. She was no longer just a member of the royal family. She was an independent moral voice, and institutions rarely forgive those who speak in their own name. The tension reached its breaking point in December 1992, when Prime Minister John Major announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales had officially separated. The statement, carefully worded, emphasized that they would both continue royal duties and co-parent their children. But the meaning was unmistakable. The marriage was over. The fairy tale had ended not with death, but with a press release. Public reaction was strangely tender. Far from losing sympathy, Diana gained it. She appeared calm, dignified, softly sad, the embodiment of grace under humiliation. The public sided with her instinctively. Charles, despite his sincerity, could not compete with her emotional fluency. He spoke in facts, she spoke in feelings. And in the late 20th century, feelings had begun to win. The years that followed were paradoxical. Freed from the constraints of marriage, Diana seemed more radiant than ever. Her fashion evolved from pastel dresses to sleek modern lines, confident, almost regal in independence. Yet behind that glow, her private struggles deepened. She longed for peace, but was pursued everywhere she went. Each new photograph reignited the old drama. There was also something quietly tragic in her fame. The same compassion that drew her to the suffering of others couldn't always soothe her own. Friends recall her late-night phone calls, her bursts of laughter followed by silence, her restless search for understanding. She had millions of admirers and almost no confidants. Even her friends were sometimes sources for tabloids, selling fragments of her trust for profit. She once sighed, "Everyone wants a piece of me, but who wants me whole?" Through it all, she clung to her sons. William and Harry became her anchor. She shielded them from scandal as best she could, teaching them humility and empathy. She wanted them to see life beyond palaces. They remember her not as a princess, but a mother, spontaneous, funny, imperfect, loving. That was her truest role, and she guarded it fiercely. In 1994, Charles attempted to reclaim the narrative with his own televised interview. He admitted his affair with Camilla, saying it began only after the marriage had irreparably broken down. The comment was measured, but the damage was done. Diana's pain was now validated in the open. The monarchy's silence cracked further. Public opinion swung again, this time firmly in her favor. For the palace, this was chaos. For the press, it was theater. And for Diana, it was survival. The voice that had once been ignored was now amplified across the world. Yet that victory carried a shadow. She had revealed too much. The press, sensing vulnerability, grew more intrusive. She couldn't walk down a street without flashbulbs. Helicopters hovered over her house. Every friendship, every phone call, every glance became speculation. She lived under constant siege, a kind of celebrity captivity. Still, there was power in her defiance. She had taken control of her story, refusing to be merely the silent wife. For better or worse, she had become something unprecedented, a royal who spoke in her own voice. The monarchy would never be the same again. In one of her recorded conversations, reflecting on that period, she said, "They build you up so high that you have to fall. And when you fall, they watch to see if you'll break. I didn't break, but I bent until I nearly did." The separation years revealed the essence of her tragedy and her transformation. She had entered the palace seeking love and emerged from it as a symbol. She had lost her marriage but gained a mission. And though she didn't yet know it, the next few years would be both her freest and her most dangerous. By the mid-1990s, the separation between Charles and Diana had become not just personal, but institutional. The marriage existed only as protocol, an arrangement of titles, duties, and photo opportunities. The two lived separate lives, bound together by history and children, divided by everything else. The press, meanwhile, had turned their private grief into serialized entertainment. Each week brought a new headline, a new leak, a new photograph. The royal family had survived wars and abdications, but never this, a slow, public disintegration. After years of silence, both sides decided, almost inevitably, to speak. And once they did, the monarchy entered a world it could no longer control. In 1994, Charles took the first step. He agreed to a television documentary intended to show his human side, a modern prince who cared about architecture, the environment, and the future of Britain. For most of the interview, he was calm and careful. Then came the question that changed everything. "Did you try to be faithful and honorable to your wife?" the interviewer asked. "Yes," Charles replied, "until it became irretrievably broken." With that single phrase, the private became public. The affair with Camilla was no longer rumor, it was fact. The effect was immediate. Diana, watching from home, felt humiliation harden into resolve. She had tried to preserve at least the appearance of dignity, but now that line had been crossed. The next move, she decided, would be hers. In 1995, she secretly arranged to record a full, unfiltered interview for the BBC program Panorama. The journalist Martin Bashir won her trust through sympathy, later questioned, but at the time persuasive. The filming took place in Kensington Palace, after dark, with minimal crew. Diana sat on a small chair in a simple black suit, no jewelry, no pomp, and spoke quietly for an hour. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried the weight of years of silence. She described her loneliness, her bulimia, her sense of betrayal. She spoke of the pressure, the isolation, the scrutiny. And then she uttered the sentence that would echo across the world. "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." It was calm, almost gentle, but devastating. That one line stripped away the last pretense of privacy. For the first time, the veil of royal secrecy was torn by someone inside it. Millions watched in silence. Some wept, others gasped. The monarchy, which had endured revolutions, now faced something quieter, but equally destabilizing: emotional truth on camera. Diana didn't attack the Queen or the institution directly. She didn't need to. Her honesty itself was the rebellion. She admitted to her own mistakes, her affairs, her struggles, her anger. But her vulnerability gave those confessions a moral force that no denial could match. It wasn't a strategic move, it was a human one, and that made it powerful. The interview aired on November 20, 1995, the same day as the Queen and Prince Philip's 48th wedding anniversary. To courtiers, the timing felt like insult. To the public, it felt like justice. The next morning, headlines filled every newspaper. Diana speaks from the heart, her truth at last. For days, television replayed her eyes, her voice, her composure. Polls showed overwhelming sympathy for her. In that moment, she wasn't just the most famous woman in the world, she was the most trusted. The monarchy reacted with shock and calculation. Inside Buckingham Palace, meetings stretched late into the night. Advisors warned that the damage was existential. The monarchy's mystique, built over centuries, had been replaced by human drama. The Queen, normally cautious, made a rare and decisive move. She wrote to both her son and daughter-in-law, advising and, in truth, ordering a formal divorce. For Diana, it was both relief and heartbreak. She had wanted freedom, but she had also wanted acknowledgement, some sign that her suffering mattered. Now, freedom was given, not as gift, but as necessity. The negotiations that followed were clinical. Lawyers discussed titles, residences, and security in neutral tones, as if they were dividing not a family, but an estate. She agreed to most terms without argument. She would keep her apartment in Kensington Palace and her role as mother to William and Harry. She would retain the title Princess of Wales, but lose the style Her Royal Highness. It was a symbolic demotion, small in protocol, enormous in meaning. The loss of HRH meant she would technically have to curtsy to her own sons. When William heard, he reportedly said, "Don't worry, Mummy, I'll give it back to you when I'm king." It was a child's promise, but it carried the tenderness that the adults had lost. The divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. After 15 years of marriage and 4 years of separation, the fairy tale ended quietly, not with ceremony, but with signatures. There was no public statement, no shared photograph, no farewell gesture, only silence and a line in history. For the monarchy, it was damage control. For Diana, it was metamorphosis. Freed from the expectations of the firm, she began to rebuild her identity. Her wardrobe changed. No more pastel suits or tiaras. She favored sleek silhouettes, neutral tones, minimalist jewelry. The change was visual, but also symbolic. She no longer needed to represent an institution. She could finally represent herself. Her public work expanded beyond Britain. She met with world leaders, charity organizers, and activists. She continued visiting hospitals, but also spoke about larger issues: mental health, addiction, landmines. The same empathy that had once made her fragile now became her weapon. She understood suffering, not as abstraction, but as experience. And people felt it. Her humanitarian image grew so strong that political leaders sought her endorsement. She used her fame deliberately to bring attention where policy could not. She once said, "If I can bring a little light into someone's life, I will." That modest phrasing disguised the scale of her influence. Wherever she went, cameras followed, and with them, public attention. Her visits could change the funding of entire organizations. Compassion had become power. But power never exists without price. Even divorced, she couldn't escape scrutiny. The press still followed her every move, now with added fascination. No longer a royal, she was freer, but also more exposed. Her private life became public currency. Every friendship became a headline, every trip a chase. Despite everything, she seemed lighter. Friends noticed her laughter returning, her sense of mischief re-emerging. She decorated her Kensington apartment with soft colors and photographs of her sons. She exercised, traveled, explored. She danced again. It was as if the girl from Althorpe had reappeared, wiser, wounded, but alive. Still, she remained haunted by the intensity of fame. In an interview not long after the divorce, she was asked what she wanted from life. She smiled faintly and said, "Peace." Then, after a pause, "Just peace." It sounded simple, but she knew it was almost impossible. Her relationship with the royal family settled into a polite distance. The Queen respected her devotion to her sons and acknowledged her charitable work. Charles, though still distant, began to find a measure of civility. Time and the demands of co-parenting softened what anger remained. But true reconciliation was beyond reach. Too much had been said, too much shown. The world, however, remained fascinated. For millions, she represented something larger than monarchy, a modern kind of courage, a refusal to be silent. She had exposed the human side of power, and in doing so, changed the institution she left behind. The royal family would never again be entirely private. Every generation after her would live, in some way, in her shadow. And yet, despite her transformation, she was still vulnerable, still searching for connection, still drawn to intensity. She once told a friend, "I give too much of myself too quickly." It was both confession and prophecy, because even as she found independence, she remained a magnet for attention, from the media, from admirers, from those who claimed to love her. By the end of 1996, Diana Spencer, once the shy girl from Althorpe, then the world's most photographed woman, had become something more elusive, a symbol of sincerity in an age of spectacle. Her story had turned full circle, from innocence to exposure, from crown to conscience. But it wasn't finished yet. A final chapter awaited, one that would end not in reconciliation, but in tragedy. Freedom came quietly, without music, without ceremony. When the divorce papers were signed, Diana walked out of the palace not as a queen-in-waiting, but as a woman alone. No entourage, no security convoy, no royal duties scheduled for the next morning. Just space and silence. The silence she had begged for, and now didn't quite know how to fill. At first, she found the emptiness frightening. For 15 years, her life had been orchestrated minute by minute. Suddenly, there were no briefings, no schedules, no one knocking on the door to tell her where to stand or smile. She could wake up when she wished. She could go for a walk without asking permission. But freedom, she discovered, is its own kind of uncertainty. It demands that you decide who you are. Her new home, Apartment 8 at Kensington Palace, reflected that shift. Inside, it was nothing like a royal residence. There were family photographs on every table, candles, soft lighting, the scent of flowers. Her son's toys lay scattered across the carpet. Friends described it as the coziest palace in England. It was a home, not a monument, and that was exactly what she wanted. Her wardrobe changed too. Gone were the pastel suits and demure hats of her royal years. In their place came sleek lines, simple elegance, clothes that reflected maturity rather than obedience. Each outfit was deliberate, but not in the old way. Before, she had dressed for the palace. Now, she dressed for herself. And fashion, once a symbol of conformity, became her quiet language of freedom. In public, she seemed transformed. Her posture straighter, her expression calmer, her smile no longer forced. The press, confused by her serenity, tried to define her again. Rebel princess, global icon, charity queen. But Diana resisted every label. She was learning to exist without needing to belong. Her humanitarian work deepened. Freed from royal protocol, she could now choose her causes without permission, and she chose those the world preferred to ignore. She campaigned for the homeless, for orphans, for victims of war. She spoke about AIDS, mental health, and the trauma of landmines. These were not ceremonial visits anymore. They were missions. She traveled to Angola, Bosnia, and Pakistan, not for photo opportunities, but to witness suffering firsthand. The photographs from these journeys show a woman walking through fields of rubble and danger, wearing a helmet and flak jacket, talking quietly with survivors. She wasn't there to be seen, she was there to see. In January 1997, she visited Angola with the Red Cross to support the campaign against landmines. She walked slowly through a cleared minefield, the word minefield written in red letters behind her. The image became one of the defining photographs of the decade. It was simple and silent, a princess walking through danger, unguarded, focused, human. Governments debated policy for years. Her single gesture moved public opinion overnight. Within months, the international community signed a treaty banning anti-personnel mines. Her influence was undeniable. What politicians discussed, she made visible. People around her noticed a new confidence, but also a familiar restlessness. She still craved closeness, still feared abandonment. Her compassion for others did not always translate into peace for herself. She could comfort thousands, but struggled to comfort the woman in the mirror. Friends said she was learning painfully to live without constant validation. She once told a confidant, "I used to look for someone to save me. Now I know I have to do it myself." Her sons remained the center of her life. She insisted on giving them as normal a childhood as possible, taking them to theme parks, cinema, even fast food restaurants. She wanted them to understand ordinary life, to speak to people easily, to feel empathy as instinct. She taught them to shake hands firmly, to listen before speaking, to care before judging. Those lessons, absorbed quietly, would shape both men long after she was gone. But fame never left her alone. Even as a private citizen, she remained the world's most photographed woman. Her every move was monitored, her friendships dissected. The paparazzi followed her everywhere, on yachts, in airports, even through hospital corridors. Sometimes she joked with them, other times she wept. The attention was relentless, but she had learned to navigate it, to give them just enough to keep them distant. In 1996, she met a heart surgeon named Hasnat Khan. He was quiet, private, and devoted to his work, a man uninterested in fame. Their relationship offered her what she had always wanted: normalcy, sincerity, safety. She admired his humility, his calmness, the steadiness of her life. For a while, she believed he might be the person with whom she could finally be anonymous. But anonymity, for her, was impossible. He disliked the attention that surrounded her. She couldn't escape it. Their romance, though deeply felt, slowly unraveled under the weight of the public gaze. When it ended, she was heartbroken, but grateful for the glimpse of what peace might have looked like. That same year, she began working with the Red Cross on broader humanitarian missions, visiting hospitals and refugee camps across continents. Each journey stripped away another layer of royal identity. She no longer traveled as a princess, but as a woman carrying empathy where politics failed. In one speech, she said softly, "Nothing brings me greater happiness than trying to help the most vulnerable. I see the world not as it is, but as it could be." Her tone was modest, but her reach was extraordinary. Even critics began to change their tone. Commentators who once dismissed her as a celebrity princess now recognized her as a serious humanitarian voice. Charities credited her with transforming public engagement, making compassion fashionable again. And yet, despite her success, she remained cautious of being idealized. "I'm not a saint," she told a reporter. "I just see pain and want it to stop." In private, she grew more spiritual. She read about mindfulness, energy, and the meaning of service. She sought comfort in simplicity, long walks, quiet music, time with her children. She tried to build a life that was hers alone. But the world, always hungry for a story, refused to let her live one quietly. As 1997 unfolded, she seemed to be moving towards something, a new chapter, perhaps even a new beginning. Her public role was expanding globally, her personal life stabilizing. She was 36, mature yet youthful, famous yet almost peaceful. The newspapers, sensing renewed fascination, began following her again. Not for scandal, but for curiosity. What would she do next? No one could have imagined how abruptly the story would end. Her reinvention had been real, but incomplete. She had reclaimed her voice, her purpose, her dignity. But she was still learning the hardest truth of all, that freedom and safety rarely coexist. The same openness that made her loved also made her exposed. She had crossed from the golden cages of monarchy into the glass cage of celebrity, and the walls were just as thin. Diana's last year was marked by contrasts, serenity and restlessness, compassion and fatigue, solitude and attention. She had finally become the woman she wanted to be, independent, purposeful, real. But the world still wanted the princess. And that contradiction would follow her into the final summer of her life. By the summer of 1997, Diana Spencer seemed lighter than she had in years. Her humanitarian work had brought her purpose. Her sons, now young teenagers, were healthy and close to her. She spoke often of travel, of charity projects, even of studying medicine in some form. Friends said she looked forward, not back. After 15 years of public storms, she was finally learning to live privately again, even under the public eye. That summer, she accepted an invitation to holiday with Mohammed Al-Fayed, the Egyptian-born businessman who owned Harrods in London. She had met him before through charity circles, and she liked his warmth and hospitality. Her two sons were spending part of their vacation at Balmoral with the royal family. She wanted a brief escape before their return. The Fayed family yacht, Jonah Kull, was waiting in the Mediterranean. There, she met Dodi Fayed, Mohammed's eldest son. Dodi was 42, charming and cosmopolitan, educated in Switzerland, fluent in several languages, quiet in manner. He had worked in film production and carried the restless energy of someone who had never quite belonged anywhere. They had met casually years before, but this time the timing was different. Both were unattached, both carrying the invisible weight of expectation. The world called it a romance. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was simply two lonely people recognizing each other's solitude. On the yacht, far from London's press, she laughed again. Photographs taken by telephoto lenses show her relaxed, sunlit, smiling, with the easy confidence of someone rediscovering joy. She phoned her sons often, sent them postcards, and told friends she felt clear. After years of calculation, she seemed impulsively free. But freedom, for Diana, never lasted long. Even in the middle of the sea, helicopters hovered. Every gesture, every touch was magnified, printed, sold. The tabloids speculated endlessly about engagement, about pregnancy, about revenge. The truth was simpler. She was happy, for once, and the world wouldn't let her be. When the summer ended, she planned to return to London, see her boys, and continue her charity work. But first, she agreed to a short stop in Paris with Dodi. They would spend one night there before flying home. It was meant to be a quiet end to a luminous summer. It became something else entirely. On the evening of August 30th, 1997, the couple dined at the Ritz Hotel, owned by Dodi's father. Outside, a crowd of photographers waited, some leaning on cars, others hiding behind lampposts. Diana was used to this by now. The flashes were as familiar as weather. She appeared calm, but tired. After dinner, around midnight, they decided to drive to Dodi's apartment near the Champs-Élysées. To avoid the press at the main entrance, they slipped out the back into a black Mercedes driven by Henry Paul, the hotel's deputy head of security. Their bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, sat in the front passenger seat. Diana and Dodi sat in the back. They weren't wearing seatbelts. The car pulled away quickly, followed by a cluster of motorcycles. Witnesses remember the hum of engines, the shouts of photographers, the echo of pursuit through the narrow Paris streets. At 12:23 a.m., entering the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the driver lost control. The Mercedes struck a concrete pillar at high speed. The sound, one bystander later said, wasn't loud, just final. The rest is history, but history told too many times loses its texture. Let's slow it down, not to relive it, but to understand its stillness. When police arrived minutes later, the car was crushed almost beyond recognition. Dodi and Henry Paul were dead at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones was critically injured. Diana was still alive, unconscious but breathing. Rescuers worked in the dim light of the tunnel, cutting through the wreckage. One paramedic later said he held her hand and heard her whisper one word, "My God," before losing consciousness again. They rushed her to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. Surgeons worked for hours. At 4 a.m., they pronounced her dead. She was 36 years old. The news spread through the world before dawn. In London, radios interrupted their programs with a single sentence. "The Princess of Wales has died in a car accident in Paris." The words hung in the air like smoke. People woke to disbelief, not just at the fact of death, but at its absurdity. How could someone so visible vanish so suddenly? For years, the public had felt she belonged to them. Now they discovered how much they had taken that belonging for granted. Within hours, crowds began gathering outside Kensington Palace. They came silently at first. Men in work clothes, mothers with prams, children clutching flowers. Then they kept coming. By nightfall, the gates were buried under a sea of bouquets and candles. Reporters estimated more than 1 million flowers within 2 days. It was the largest spontaneous public mourning Britain had ever seen. The scent of lilies and rain filled the air for weeks. The royal family, at Balmoral with William and Harry, remained silent at first. They chose privacy, believing the boys needed space to grieve. But the public read that silence as coldness. The same institution that had always valued dignity now seemed out of step with the nation's emotion. Newspapers demanded a statement. The crowd outside the palace demanded presence. People cried not just for Diana, but for the feeling she had embodied: openness, empathy, vulnerability. The monarchy, built on reserve, suddenly looked heartless. Finally, 5 days after her death, the Queen addressed the nation live on television, a rare and somber moment. She spoke not as sovereign, but as grandmother. She paid tribute to Diana's warmth, her devotion to her sons, and the love she had inspired. It was brief, measured, sincere, and it marked the quiet reconciliation between two worlds, the crown and the crowd. The funeral on September 6, 1997, was watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people, nearly half the planet. The procession moved slowly through London streets, the coffin draped in the royal standard, covered with white lilies. The card on top read simply, in a child's handwriting, "Mummy." Behind the casket walked Prince Charles, Prince Philip, Diana's brother Charles Spencer, and her two sons, 12 and 15 years old. The crowd watched in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves on stone and the distant chime of bells. It was a national ritual of sorrow and guilt, the collective realization that love, when devouring, becomes destruction. Inside Westminster Abbey, the service was dignified but human. Elton John sang "Candle in the Wind," rewritten for her. Her brother delivered a eulogy both tender and defiant, promising that his sister's blood family would protect her sons from the same fate. The applause that followed was unprecedented, a public claiming of a princess who had never truly belonged to the palace. After the service, her body was taken not to a royal crypt, but to her childhood home, Althorpe. There, on a small island in a quiet lake, she was buried among trees and birdsong. It was where her story had begun, and where it closed, not in grandeur, but in peace. The days that followed felt suspended. Television channels played continuous tributes. People who had never met her wept as if for family. It was more than grief. It was reflection. Through her life and death, people saw their own contradictions, the longing for perfection and the hunger for authenticity, the fascination with fame and the guilt it brings. Diana had embodied all of it. She had been both mirror and window, showing the world to itself and letting the world see inside a palace for the first time. Her death changed Britain. It forced the monarchy to modernize, to recognize emotion as strength. It changed journalism too, at least briefly, prompting questions about ethics, privacy, and the price of obsession. But most of all, it changed how people understood empathy in public life. She had turned compassion into a kind of leadership, and even in death, that example remained. Years later, historians would call her the first truly modern royal, the one who bridged the age of mystery and the age of transparency. She wasn't born to be that symbol. She became it by surviving pain in full view of the world. Her story, read calmly, is not one of glamour or tragedy, but of humanity, the attempt to remain kind in a system that rewards control, the courage to show emotion in a world that fears it. The tunnel where she died remains there, unchanged, passed by thousands of cars each day. Above it stands a replica of the flame from the Statue of Liberty, an unintended memorial that visitors still decorate with flowers. It is not a shrine built by government, but by memory, the kind she would have understood. And perhaps that is the truest ending. Diana never belonged fully to the crown or to the people. She lived between them, too open for the one, too fragile for the other. But in that space between duty and emotion, she revealed something the world had forgotten, that tenderness, even when misunderstood, has its own kind of power.